And welcome back and good evening if you've just joined us. This is ANN7 Prime with me, Cindy Mabi. And our top story this hour, the presidency says it will appeal the North Gauteng High Court judgment. This is after the court set aside the removal of former National Director of Public Prosecutions, Nxasana. The presidency says it will appeal on the basis of separation of powers principle and the constitutional legality. The judge ruled that it would not be just to reinstate Nxasana and declared the position vacant. The court holds that President Jacob Zuma is conflicted in appointing a new NPA head because of his current legal challenges. The post will be left vacant for 60 days and Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa must appoint a new NPA head. And this is a blow to current NDPP Shaun Abrahams, who must now vacate his post.
The presidency notes the judgment handed down today by the North Gauteng High Court in the application launched by two NGOs against the President of the Republic of South Africa, seeking the removal of the current National Director of Public Prosecutions. While the President awaits a full briefing on the judgment, he has been advised that an earlier assessment displays with respect various grounds upon which a successful appeal may be prosecuted. The National Prosecuting Authority is an important institution in our constitutional democracy, appointments in respect of which are not made lightly. Together with judges who are likewise appointed by the President, the National Director of Public Prosecutions plays a vital role in the criminal justice system. Minded by the principle of the separation of powers, constitutional legality and the rule of law, the judgment will be appealed. Out of deference to the court and the judicial system, these grounds will be properly ventilated in the normal course in court proceedings.
I think what is important is that this judgment, among others, presents an opportunity. I think the appeal recourse process will clarify, because the way it stands at the moment, it does create problems. And I think it's only when our jurisprudence create recourse levels where I think other questions will be clarified. It's early days to make speculations whether the North Gauteng made an error or not. But politically, it's an issue that we can make a judgment call. A higher court must make a determination whether the North Gauteng was right or wrong. We've noted the judgment of the North Gauteng as the African National Congress in relation to the appointment of the NDPP. And we have noted including its serious implications. However, we've also noted the fact that parties involved may take a decision to appeal the decision, and already the indication is that the President would appeal the decision. We hope that all parties involved, whatever decision they take, they will do so in the interest of administration of justice, in the interest of the NPA, and in the interest of the country.
Now, the ruling has made the National Director of Public Prosecutions, Shaun Abrahams, lose his job for no fault of his own. The NDPP has been asked to vacate his position immediately. Shaun Abrahams loses his job as his predecessor's resignation was considered illegal. Nxasana's reinstatement is ruled out by the court, and the Deputy President is asked to appoint a permanent head of prosecutions within 30 or 60 days. And the court says that President Zuma is ineligible to appoint the NDPP as he is conflicted. And we cross to my colleague Kiyorape Tsope for the key takeaways on the judgment.
But let's just take a look at the key takeaways from the judgment. First up, the settlement agreement between the President, the Minister of Justice and Nxasana, dated May 2015, has been reviewed, declared invalid and set aside. The next point to take note of, the termination of Nxasana as the National Director of Public Prosecutions has been declared unconstitutional and invalid. Point number 3 to note, the decision to authorize payment to Nxasana of 17 million rand has been declared invalid and set aside. He's, of course, got to pay that money back. The appointment of Shaun Abrahams as the National Director of Public Prosecutions has been declared invalid and set aside. The incumbent president may not appoint, suspend or remove the National Director of Public Prosecutions. Also, the Deputy President is expected now to be responsible for the decisions relating to the appointment and suspension of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. And finally, an order of invalidity suspended for a period of 60 days or until such a time as the Deputy President has appointed a new National Director of Public Prosecutions.
We had an extraordinarily strong judgment delivered by the court this morning. Court sitting at 3 persons, so en banc. It wasn't the determination of a single judge, but just three judges sitting at the bench. And as I said, we had this extraordinarily strong judgment that has enormous repercussions for the health of our democracy and its institutions. The judgment that was given found in respect of the applicant. Freedom Under Law was one of those applicants. So we're very happy with the findings that were made today.
And to answer the question on the prospects of success for Jacob Zuma's appeal, we have Botsang Moilwa, political analyst, live in studio. And Paul Ngobeni, legal expert, joins us on the phone line. Mosiritiane from Mosiritiane Attorneys. And we have Oliver Dixon, a social political commentator and analyst. Good evening to our guests, and thank you so much for your time. I'll just start with you, Mr. Ngobeni, in your view on the separation of powers principle in this particular matter. This question has arisen before in whether there is a judicial overreach in matters pertaining to the precedent.
There is clearly a judicial overreach in all matters pertaining to President Jacob Zuma. I mean, one of the things that struck me as very odd in this case is that there was an attempt to impugn the president's decision to have an inquiry into whether Mr. Nxasana was fit and proper in the first place. But if you recall, the Constitutional Court directed him to do exactly that. If you remember the Menzies Melani judgment, the court said that the president has a heightened duty to make sure that when he appoints a person in that very important position of the National Director of Public Prosecution, that the president must satisfy himself that the person is fit and proper, and that person must objectively speaking be qualified for the position. So in this case, there were allegations against Nxasana. Some of us didn't agree with those allegations, but the fact remains there were allegations, and that needed to be aired in public so that a decision could be made about whether he was fit and proper. Instead of going through the hearing, Mr. Nxasana exercised his right like any other citizen, which was to offer his resignation. In return, after bargaining with the executive for that, he got 17 million rand, which was equivalent to the remainder of his contract. There's nothing unconstitutional about that.
So you're saying, just hold on the line, Mr. Ngobeni, just your view, Botsang, in light of whether procedurally all of this was objective and impartial. What is your view on the judgment by Judge President Mlambo?
Well, Cindy, good evening and good evening to the viewers. I don't think it was objective and impartial. You know, this is one of those court cases whereby the whole nation is sitting there and saying, wow, well, based on what? And I'm telling you, if the presidency, and we all know that they are going to appeal, and the ANC has come forward as well, the National Director of Public Prosecutions may file an application, they will succeed, and that's my view. And I will tell you the reasons behind what I'm saying is, one of the critical points that the judge based his decision on is that President Zuma is conflicted due to the pending corruption allegations. They are pending. There is no, at the moment, in the Republic of South Africa judicial system, there is no charges against Jacob Zuma that are active. They are pending. Now, if the judge says this decision is based on the fact that if he appoints the National Director of Public Prosecution, then the National Director must make a decision whether to charge him or not. It's conflict of interest. However, the very same judge goes further and says the Deputy President of the country should appoint a National Director of Public Prosecutions because the president is conflicted. But the same judge is putting a blind eye and is forgetting that the Deputy President of this country is equally facing criminal charges, which are at the moment allegations regarding Marikana. The National Director of Public Prosecution is supposed also to make a decision on criminally prosecuting people who are purported or alleged to have been involved in Marikana. And the name of the Deputy President is mentioned among those people. I do not say he's involved. I'm saying there's allegations, his name is there. There's allegations against Zuma, his name is there. Now, these two presidents or heads of states, the president and deputy president, there is purported allegations of criminal activity and corruption that is hanging over their heads, and the National Director of Public Prosecution must make a decision whether to prosecute them or not. Now, if Jacob Zuma cannot deal with this conflicting interest, how can Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa deal with the same thing? That's another thing. Also, I think the judge has overstepped in this instance. And you look at the Sean Abraham's case, for example. Let's use common sense, and legal experts will talk. Sean Abrahams applies for a job. When somebody is said to be conflicted and is not fit to hold office, and he gets a golden handshake. Now today, somebody who has applied for a job, has gone through the processes, must vacate office when he has absolutely nothing to do with his predecessor.
Yeah, let's just get that legal expert the perspective. Mr. Ngobeni, just on that part where Sean Abrahams, had followed through due process and got appointed, there's also the allegations or the narrative that he is a protector of Zuma and that there has been a pattern in the misappointments, or rather, appointments of the NDPP not being fit for office and creating a security breach, if you want. How does all of that fit in the rights of Sean Abrahams and in light of this judgment?
Well, I think Sean Abrahams has been unfairly treated. If you really think about it, here's a situation where, as your previous speaker has mentioned, he was properly appointed because there was a vacant position of NDPP. Now the court said the position was not vacant because it has declared the resignation of Mr. Nxasana to have been unconstitutional. Well, that I'm sorry to use a strong language there, but it's absurd. You cannot have a judgment that says a position is not vacant. And I think the court did that deliberately to avoid dealing with the fact that Section 12 of the NPA Act specifies grounds on which an incumbent NDPP can be removed. And the court doesn't have any of those grounds. So instead they are saying, well, his appointment was void from the beginning because the his predecessor and his resignation were not valid. So that in itself, again, you are talking not just about judicial overreach, but it's a clear case of judicial incompetence, because you cannot have such an illogical reasoning that says that simply because the incumbent, the predecessor was or decided to resign under circumstances they deem unconstitutional, then it means that even his successor, who has nothing to do with the unconstitutionality, that his appointment is somehow to be impugned. That cannot be.
Mr. Dixon, your view whether this judgment has really thrown a spanner in the works, and especially when it comes to Sean Abrahams, who's been suspected to be linked. The president has mentioned in the judgment that he has close, or rather been suspected of protecting the president. How does all of this now give him the ammunition to either appeal or defend the ruling?
That's immaterial, because whether or not Sean Abrahams is protecting Jacob Zuma or not, procedures are not protecting Jacob Zuma. Procedures which guide how these things should work is what's objective. So importantly, the Supreme Court of Appeal did rule that the charges must be reinstated. And so the NPA has to take that under consideration again. So whether or not Sean Abrahams was protecting Jacob Zuma, he has to go and review those charges and, in fact, reinstate them, right? Pending, obviously, an appeal outcome on that matter. So the procedures are very clear. However, what's sticky about the ruling for me is that whether or not you love or hate Jacob Zuma, you have to respect the rule of law here. And importantly, nothing says that conflict of interest is good enough grounds for a judge to remove a president from performing a presidential function. The only grounds under which, and this is how far as I understand it, that a president can, the role of a president can be delegated to someone else is if the president is incapacitated. And the rules for incapacitated are very clear. The president must must be vital, must be severely ill. That's to say he must be in hospital. The president must be out of the country, or the president must declare himself incapacitated. None of those grounds have been met in this instance, so the president can't be removed. Conflict of interest is not good enough. And here's why it's not good enough. Because it then says that you do not believe in the separation of powers, that you do not believe that your institutions are independent and can function as independent institutions. And once you make that declaration, you don't believe in the democracy that was so hard fought for in South Africa. That's the second important thing to notice about this ruling. But the third thing there is the appointment of the deputy president as the appointee of the NDPP. One, this makes it very uncomfortable right now, given that there's an elective conference coming up. The deputy president, who's campaigning at the moment, has to make a really uncomfortable decision. Chances are a rash decision is going to make if this ruling upholds pending an appeal.
Yeah, I was saying about disruption in the sense of the processes, because now there had been fresh submissions made by President Zuma, including the opposition, and arguing whether the charges should be reinstated. What happens to that process now?
Procedurally, one, the process of the president, that's a separate case to say whether they should be reinstated or not. And it cannot be ignored whether it should. So, one of the errors that the judge did today was to ignore that there's a process pending. But also,
can I just quickly add to that? The error that was made there was to assume that the charges are instated and active.
Yes.
Jacob Zuma is facing absolutely no criminal charges as it stands. That man is a citizen in good standing. So you cannot, but also just what happens to the presumption of innocence before proven guilty? Because in this instance, even if the charges were instated against him, you have to grant him the benefit of the doubt of innocence
but
until
to avoid
proven
not
guilty.
being in contempt of court, the deputy president now has to appoint a new national director of public prosecutions immediately. He doesn't have to wait the 60 days. How does it work, Mr. Ngobeni? Sorry, before we go to you. Mr. Ngobeni, how does it work now in terms of what the deputy president ought to do according to the court ruling?
Well, he has been given 60 days, but as we know, the other parties have a right to appeal. And once you file an appeal, that has the effect of automatically staying the judgment. So once the appeal is filed, that means that all that the judge has said is basically put on hold until the higher court makes a decision.
Okay, so this could be beyond the 60 days prescription.
It's certainly going to be beyond the 60 days.
All right, please stay on the line, Mr. Ngobeni.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I concur with it. Actually, the only thing that could have happened was Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa to start the process. He can't just even appoint, because it's a process. There must be shortlisting, there must be interviews. It's a very lengthy process. However, the presidency has indicated that they are going to appeal within reasonable time. They responded today that within reasonable time they are going to appeal. And Mr. Ngobeni is correct. But Cindy, also, there's an element of, I think the judiciary putting the two heads of states, if I may put it that way, leaders of both the country and the ruling party, into loggerheads, you understand? And he's saying to us as citizens, these two people are not talking the same language, being from the same party, and they're not giving each other advices and tips. We know that Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa is the head of big government business. And in this instance now, it takes us back to 2007 towards Polokwane, where President Mbeki was faced with a situation where he had, because of a judge comment and statement, not of charges against Jacob Zuma, a statement in mentioning he had to fire Jacob Zuma to say you've been alleged to be corrupt and you're being investigated, and look what happened. We are back to Polokwane 2007. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's Nazareth 2017, whereby, I look at this thing from political perspective. It's not just judicial. There's a political element. There's white capital interest. There's influence from imperialists into this whole process, whereby we all know, and it's not a secret, what white capital prefer, or who white capital prefers to lead the ANC. And look at what happened today. Is it a coincidence? I think people in this country must start asking proper questions. They must start looking deep into this thing. But the appeal process is going to save us chaos in the country.
Yeah, Mr. Ngobeni, before we come to you, Oliver, is it legally, but maybe we'll start with Mr. Ngobeni, legally expected that the charges should be reinstated based on the history of these charges against President Jacob Zuma, and of course what the Supreme Court of Appeals had ruled on, in the sense that the charges, or rather new new submissions need to be made, or that dropping of the charges was invalid?
Let me answer it. There are two sides to it. The first one is that the charges, if the prosecution was to look at the matter objectively, the so-called charges against Jacob Zuma will never see the light of the day. That they will be done, dusted, and buried. You can go back and look at the Public Protector Mushwana's view and his ruling on the same matter, which is binding because it was never appealed. Judge Msimanga's ruling on how Jacob Zuma was treated. That is a judicial pronouncement that's entitled to respect. Even the Seriti Commission of Inquiry into the arms deal has a bearing on it. Then you can go on and look at other issues that followed after that. The fact remains that if the prosecution was to objectively look at the so-called charges or allegations against Jacob Zuma, there will not be a case to be reinstated or prosecuted.
Okay.
It's only a politically, if you allow the case to be carried politically, you know, the political narrative against Zuma, yes, you can keep it going for the next century.
Yeah, Mr. Dixon, in your view?
I think really Jacob Zuma has been going through a lot of allegations throughout his 2 terms of presidency. And I think he really yearns for the opportunity to clear his name. I think really the only way to clear his name is in the courts of law, not in the courts of public opinion. So personally, I'd like to see these charges actually being reinstated, for Jacob Zuma to actually go to court, and for these things to actually be tested in a court of law. But that's a separate issue in terms of the pending charges against him. But what's germane to this conversation, and quite importantly here, is again the separation of powers here. I think that was entirely overlooked in this judgment, and I think that it should be appealed in this instance. Importantly, I think the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services should also appeal this judgment, or should also at least have a say in this, right? The chairperson there, Dr. Muchega, needs to come forward and say, look, as per what the Portfolio Committee views, this is not the right way to do it. The Portfolio Committee believes that the president should have a fair chance to appoint here, but importantly, we should have a fair chance to appoint, and Parliament closed just last week, so it's going to be an even lengthier process. People are going into an elective conference in a week from now. It's going to be an even lengthier process. So the appointment process may actually only conclude February next year, and that's quite lengthy.
Okay, and looking at the Public Protector's remedial action on President Jacob Zuma appointing a judicial inquiry and Judge Mogoeng appointing the commissioner, and this particular process as well, it seems like a repetition or duplication of trying to remove the president's executive powers based on what the Constitution provides for him.
Absolutely, Cindy. And even that one, the recommendations of the Public Protector's Office, you know, they haven't seen light until today. You can see how long it was. It's actually almost a year now since we have gone through that. But, you know, it is very disturbing when courts of law in this country break the laws. Because what happened today, a judge of a high court broke a constitutional law of this country. And as Oliver was saying, the president is not facing any charges. Let us be very clear with that one. And that's nothing under the sun that, you know, prohibits him from performing his constitutional duties. Actually, if they are saying the president must not do his duties, they actually are taking us as citizens of this country who have given Jacob Zuma, who have given Parliament and the National Assembly work to do. Now,
so even if he's been implicated, he's been mentioned in State of Capture report. There are books, you know, myriad of books written and articles about his involvement, joining the dots and seeing the hand of Zuma and all of these things.
All these things, I've always said, can they go to court, face a judicial process? Zuma must be found guilty and be removed from power when proper judicial process has taken place. Without that, with media allegations, media reports, haters' opinions, lovers' opinions, and so forth, we can't run the country like that.
Yeah, just quickly, I just want to check Botsang's language here quickly. It's very strong and very dangerous to say that a judge of the High Court broke the law today. That was not the case. The judge may have made a wrong calling, but that can always be appealed, and this is why appeal processes exist. We must continue to have confidence in our justice system to execute its duties. In this instance, when a judge makes a wrong calling, the justice system self-corrects, and in this instance, hopefully it will self-correct.
Okay, legal expert, an opinion from you, Paul Ngobeni, whether the judge in this ruling broke the law, in those words, just to appease, I guess. When
a judge does not follow the Constitution, he's breaking the law. Absolutely. That is, there's no other way of sugarcoating it. But one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that the issues of conflict of interest within the judiciary, judges are able to decide that. For instance, if a matter comes up before the judges where one of the judges has a conflict, they recuse themselves. It's done within the judiciary. Same thing within Parliament. Same thing within the executive. What the judge should have done is to allow the executive to deal with perceived or actual conflict of interest if they do arise, instead of prematurely trying to gerrymander a system where a person who's now aspiring to be a president, who's been calling his president a rapist, is now going to be allowed tomorrow to appoint a prosecutor whose decisions might impact the president. What if tomorrow someone files a lawsuit to say that Ramaphosa is inherently conflicted because of his view that the president committed rape and that the president is unfit, and that Ramaphosa himself wants to take that position? You see, the judge did violate the law, and I think he transgressed the proper bounds of the separation of powers principle.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. In the manipulation and, of course, all sorts of other angles that we're exploring around the prospects of the success of the appeal by President Jacob Zuma. It's obviously something that's going to be quite tedious, but it's a story that we're keeping a close eye on. Oliver Dixon is a social political analyst joining us in studio, Botsang Moiloa, political analyst, and on the line we had Mr. Paul Ngobeni, a legal expert. Thanks so much for watching. Up next, ANC Decides with Mfundo Mabalane.